Story 1. David had always been an avid camper. The allure of stealth camping, the thrill of evading discovery, and the solitude of nature captivated him. This time, he decided to venture into the Whispering Forest, a dense and ancient woodland known for its thick canopy and eerie silence. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences and mysterious disappearances, but David dismissed them as mere folklore. Armed with his gear, he was ready for his greatest adventure yet. He parked his car at the edge of the forest as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp and filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. David hoisted his backpack and took his first steps into the unknown, excitement bubbling within him. As he made his way deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller and the underbrush thicker. The path became less defined, but David relished the challenge. He followed a meandering stream, its gentle babbling providing a comforting soundtrack to his journey. After about an hour, he found a secluded spot nestled between two large oaks, perfect for his hidden campsite. David pitched his tent, blending it seamlessly with the surrounding foliage. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in twilight. He built a small, smokeless fire and prepared a simple meal, savoring the tranquility. As darkness enveloped the forest, he felt a sense of contentment. The Whispering Forest was proving to be a peaceful retreat. David crawled into his tent, the cool air seeping through the fabric. He wrapped himself in his sleeping bag and drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sounds of the forest. It wasn't long, however, before he was jolted awake by a faint tapping sound. He lay still, listening intently. The tapping was rhythmic and seemed to come from all around him. Probably just a woodpecker, he muttered to himself, trying to calm his nerves. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. He unzipped his tent and shone his flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. David's heart raced as the tapping continued, now seeming to encircle his tent. He felt a prickle of fear, but dismissed it, blaming his imagination. He lay back down, trying to ignore the noise. Just as he began to drift off again, he heard a new sound, a whisper, faint and barely audible. "Leave now," the voice said, sending chills down his spine. He bolted upright, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He scanned the darkness, but there was no one there. His mind raced. Was someone playing a prank on him? Determined to find the source, David stepped out of his tent, knife in hand. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. He stood there, shivering in the cold night air, listening. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. Tall and gaunt, it was utterly still. David's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Panic surged through him. He rushed back into his tent, heart pounding. The whispers resumed, more insistent this time. "Leave now." David spent the rest of the night wide awake, gripping his knife and flashlight. The whispers continued intermittently, always urging him to leave. He could feel eyes on him, though he saw nothing. As dawn approached, the whispers ceased, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest. Exhausted and unnerved, David decided to pack up and leave. As he emerged from his tent, he noticed something he hadn't seen in the darkness. Strange symbols carved into the trees around his campsite. They were unlike anything he'd seen before, intricate and ominous. A sense of dread washed over him. He quickly dismantled his camp and retraced his steps back to the car, the feeling of being watched never leaving him. On his way back, he encountered an old man collecting firewood. The man eyed him curiously. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, with a chuckle. David hesitated, then recounted his experience. The old man's expression grew serious. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "This forest has a dark history. Many who come here don't leave. Those who do are never the same." David felt a chill run down his spine. The old man continued, "The whispers you heard are warnings. The forest spirits don't like intruders." David thanked the old man and hurried back to his car, his mind racing. He drove away, vowing never to return. But the memory of that night haunted him, the whispers echoing in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him out of the forest. Back in the safety of his home, David tried to forget his ordeal. But the strange symbols and the whispers plagued his thoughts. He began researching the whispering forest, uncovering stories of disappearances and hauntings dating back centuries. The legends spoke of a group of settlers who had angered the forest spirits by desecrating sacred land. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the eerie whispers. Driven by a need to understand, David contacted a local historian, Professor Evelyn Hart. She was an expert on the forest's lore and agreed to meet him. In her cluttered office, surrounded by old books and artifacts, David recounted his experience. Professor Hart listened intently. "The symbols you saw are wards," she explained. "They're meant to keep the spirits at bay. If they were around your campsite, it means something was trying to protect you." David shuddered. "From what?" "The spirits in that forest are vengeful," she said. "They don't forget or forgive. The whispers are their way of warning intruders. But if you ignore them, the consequences can be dire." David felt a sense of foreboding. What should I do? Professor Hart sighed. "The best thing would be to stay away. But if you're determined to go back, you need to make peace with the spirits. Find the heart of the forest, offer a gift, and ask for forgiveness." Despite his fear, David felt compelled to return to the whispering forest. He needed closure. Armed with knowledge and a sense of purpose, he prepared for the journey. He packed offerings, items of nature and symbols of peace, and set off. The forest was just as he remembered, dense and foreboding. He retraced his steps to the campsite, now marked by the mysterious symbols. The whispers began almost immediately, soft and insistent. David steeled himself and ventured deeper into the forest, guided by an unseen force. Hours passed as he navigated the thick underbrush. He reached a clearing with an ancient oak at its center. The air was thick with tension. David placed his offerings at the base of the tree and knelt, speaking aloud. "I'm sorry for intruding. Please accept these gifts and forgive my trespass." The forest fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Then a soft breeze stirred, rustling the leaves. The whispers returned, but this time they were different, softer, almost welcoming. David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. As he stood, he saw the figure again, standing at the edge of the clearing. This time, it felt less menacing. The figure nodded, then disappeared into the trees. David took it as a sign that his apology had been accepted. David left the forest feeling lighter, the oppressive presence gone. He returned home, and for the first time in weeks, he slept peacefully. The whispers no longer haunted his dreams. He shared his experience with Professor Hart, who was relieved and intrigued. "You've done something few have managed," she said. "You made peace with the forest. Perhaps now the spirits will rest." David nodded, feeling a sense of closure. The whispering forest had tested him, but he had come out the other side stronger and wiser. He knew he would never forget the experience, but he also knew he had learned a valuable lesson about respecting the unknown. The whispering forest remained a place of mystery and danger, but David no longer feared it. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, with a deeper understanding of the delicate balance between humanity and nature. And though he would continue his camping adventures, he would always remember to tread lightly and respect the places he visited, for some secrets were best left undisturbed. Story 2. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the forest floor as Mark hiked deeper into the wilderness. The crunch of leaves beneath his boots echoed through the silent woods. He relished the solitude, the feeling of being alone with nature. As an avid outdoorsman, Mark was no stranger to the thrill of stealth camping. The idea of setting up camp in remote locations, far from the noise and bustle of civilization, appealed to him in a primal way. Tonight, he had chosen a secluded spot deep within the national forest, miles away from any marked trails or campsites. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and a gentle breeze whispered through the trees. Mark found a small clearing tucked away amidst a grove of ancient pines. It felt like the perfect spot for his night under the stars. With practiced efficiency, he set up his tent, a sturdy dome of nylon and mesh that blended seamlessly with the surrounding foliage. He built a small fire pit and gathered firewood, enjoying the rhythmic crackle of flames as they licked at the darkness. Night fell like a velvet curtain, enveloping the forest in an eerie stillness. Mark sat by the fire, savoring the warmth against the chill of the night. The stars shimmered overhead, casting a soft glow on the world below. As the hours slipped by, Mark's eyelids grew heavy, and he retired to his tent, cocooned in the soft glow of his flashlight. He drifted into a fitful sleep, the sounds of the forest lulling him into dreams. But his slumber was soon interrupted by a faint rustling outside the tent. Mark stirred, his senses on high alert. He strained to listen, but the noise had ceased as quickly as it had begun. He shrugged it off as the wind playing tricks on the trees and closed his eyes once more. Hours passed, and Mark was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for his knife, the cold steel offering little comfort against the unknown. He unzipped the tent flap and peered outside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a beacon. But the beam revealed nothing but shadows dancing among the trees. He scanned the perimeter of the camp, his pulse racing with adrenaline. Just as he was about to retreat back into the safety of his tent, he caught sight of something moving in the darkness. It was a figure, tall and imposing, its features obscured by the veil of night. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he watched it approach, its movements slow and deliberate. Fear gripped Mark like a vice as the figure drew nearer, its form illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. He could feel its gaze boring into him, a silent threat hanging heavy in the air. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice trembling with uncertainty. But the figure remained silent, its presence looming over him like a specter from the depths of his nightmares. With a surge of courage, Mark stepped forward, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. He squared his shoulders, ready to confront whatever lurked in the shadows. But as he drew closer, the figure seemed to waver, its form flickering like a mirage. Mark blinked, and in an instant, it was gone, leaving behind nothing but the whisper of the wind through the trees. Confusion clouded Mark's thoughts as he scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of the mysterious intruder. But the forest remained silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation. With a shiver of unease, Mark retreated back into his tent, the events of the night weighing heavily on his mind. He lay awake for hours, the silence of the forest oppressive in its intensity, but just as he was on the brink of sleep, he heard it. A soft, insistent tapping coming from outside the tent. Mark's blood ran cold as he listened, the sound echoing through the stillness of the night. He reached for his flashlight, his hands trembling as he cast its beam into the darkness. But the tapping continued, growing louder and more persistent with each passing moment. Heart pounding, Mark unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside, his senses on high alert. But the source of the sound eluded him, disappearing into the inky blackness of the forest. A sense of dread washed over him as he realized he was not alone. Something lurked in the shadows, watching and waiting with bated breath. With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, Mark knew he had to act fast. He gathered his belongings and prepared to flee into the safety of the night. But as he turned to leave, a voice called out from the darkness, its tone low and menacing. "You cannot escape," it whispered, sending shivers down Mark's spine. He froze in place, his mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee from the unseen threat that lurked in the shadows. But something held him rooted to the spot, a sense of dread tightening its grip around his heart. With a surge of desperation, Mark bolted into the night, his footsteps echoing through the silent woods. But no matter how fast he ran, the darkness seemed to swallow him whole, its suffocating embrace closing in around him. As Mark stumbled through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps, he knew he was running out of time. The unseen presence that haunted the forest was closing in, its malevolent gaze fixed upon him with unyielding intensity. With a final burst of adrenaline, Mark broke through the trees and stumbled into a small clearing, the moonlight casting eerie shadows upon the ground. But before he could catch his breath, he felt a cold hand close around his throat, its grip like ice against his skin. With a cry of terror, Mark lashed out, his fists pounding against the darkness with desperate fury. But the unseen assailant was relentless, its grasp unyielding in its ferocity. As Mark fought for his life, he felt something stir deep within him, a primal rage boiling to the surface. With a surge of power, he summoned every ounce of strength he possessed and unleashed it upon his attacker, the force of his blow sending shock waves rippling through the air. And in that moment, the darkness shattered, its hold broken by the light of Mark's courage. With a triumphant roar, he banished the shadows from the forest, his spirit ablaze with newfound resolve. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Mark emerged from the wilderness, a survivor of the darkest night. For in the heart of the wild, he had faced his greatest fear and emerged victorious, a testament to the indomitable spirit that lies within us all. Story 3. Jack was an experienced outdoorsman who lived for the thrill of stealth camping. The idea of spending nights in the wilderness, hidden away from the prying eyes of civilization, appealed to him. It was a way to reconnect with nature, to experience the world as it once was, wild and untamed. This time, Jack had chosen an isolated part of a national forest, far from any trails or campsites. The forest was rumored to be haunted, but Jack dismissed the tales as local folklore designed to keep people away. To him, the stories were nothing more than an added thrill. He parked his car at a small, overgrown parking lot and set off with his backpack. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the dense canopy of trees. Jack hiked for hours, deeper into the forest, until he found a small clearing that seemed perfect for his camp. It was surrounded by ancient oaks, their twisted branches creating a natural barrier. He set up his tent, a small dark green dome that blended seamlessly with the surroundings. After gathering firewood, he built a small fire, its crackling flames the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. As night fell, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in around him. But Jack felt at peace, enjoying the solitude and the connection to nature. The first night was uneventful. Jack slept soundly, the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl lulling him into a deep sleep. The next morning, he woke early and spent the day exploring the forest, fascinated by the untouched beauty of the wilderness. As dusk approached, Jack returned to his camp, tired but satisfied. He cooked a simple meal over the fire and settled in for another night under the stars. But as darkness enveloped the forest, he began to feel a strange unease. The air seemed thicker, the silence more oppressive. Lying in his tent, Jack heard a faint rustling outside. He sat up, his senses on high alert. He listened intently, but the noise had stopped. Convinced it was just an animal, he lay back down, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. A few hours later, he was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. His heart raced as he grabbed his flashlight and shone it outside the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The footsteps had ceased. Jack lay back down, but sleep eluded him. The footsteps echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that he was not alone. The night stretched on, the darkness growing thicker and more suffocating. On the third night, Jack was on edge. The sense of unease had grown stronger, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, but the rational part of his mind was losing the battle. As he sat by the fire, he thought he saw a shadow move at the edge of the clearing. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The shadows seemed to dance and flicker, playing tricks on his eyes. Later that night, as he lay in his tent, he heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, more deliberate. Jack grabbed his flashlight and knife, his heart pounding in his chest. He unzipped the tent flap and shone the light outside. And then he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he watched it stand there, motionless. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. But the figure remained silent, its presence looming over him like a specter from a nightmare. With a surge of courage, Jack stepped out of the tent, his flashlight and knife at the ready. He approached the figure slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. But as he drew closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, disappearing before his eyes. Jack stood there, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. The figure was gone, leaving behind an eerie silence. The next morning, Jack felt a deep sense of dread. He couldn't shake the image of the figure from his mind. He packed up his camp and moved deeper into the forest, hoping to escape whatever was haunting him. He found another clearing, even more secluded than the first, and set up his tent. But the sense of unease followed him. The forest seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more persistent. Jack lay in his tent, his knife clutched in his hand, his heart racing. He listened as the footsteps circled his camp, drawing closer with each pass. Suddenly, the tent fabric rippled as if something brushed against it. Jack's blood ran cold as he heard a whisper, faint but clear. "Leave now." With a surge of adrenaline, he burst out of the tent, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the silent trees and the oppressive night. Desperation clawed at Jack's mind as he packed up his camp in a frenzy, not caring about the noise. He needed to leave, to escape the malevolent presence that haunted him. Jack stumbled through the forest, branches clawing at him as he ran. The footsteps followed, relentless and unyielding. He could feel the presence behind him, a cold, malevolent force that sent shivers down his spine. He ran for hours, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body aching with exhaustion. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was right behind him, watching and waiting. As dawn approached, Jack found himself at the edge of a small lake. He collapsed by the water's edge, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense of unease remained. He sat there, staring out at the calm water, trying to catch his breath. But the silence was shattered by a low, menacing whisper, "You cannot escape." Jack's blood ran cold as he turned to see the figure standing at the edge of the forest, its dark form silhouetted against the rising sun. It began to move toward him, its footsteps echoing through the stillness. With a cry of terror, Jack stumbled to his feet and ran along the shoreline, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure followed, its movements slow and deliberate, but it was always there, always watching. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack's mind raced with fear and desperation. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. He needed to confront whatever was haunting him. He found a narrow trail that led into the dense forest and followed it, hoping to find a place to make a stand. The trail wound through the trees, the canopy above blocking out the sunlight. Jack's footsteps echoed through the silence, each step a reminder of the unseen presence that followed him. He found a small rocky outcrop and climbed to the top, his knife clutched tightly in his hand. He stood there, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his eyes scanning the forest below. And then he saw it, the figure moving slowly toward him, its dark form standing out against the green of the trees. "Why are you doing this?" Jack shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "What do you want?" The figure stopped at the base of the outcrop, its dark eyes staring up at him. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice low and menacing. With a surge of anger and fear, Jack raised his knife, ready to defend himself. "Leave me alone," he shouted. The figure began to climb the outcrop, its movements slow and deliberate. Jack's heart raced as he backed up, his knife held out in front of him. As the figure reached the top, Jack lunged forward, his knife slicing through the air. But the figure was quick, its hand closing around his wrist with an icy grip. Jack struggled, but the figure's strength was overwhelming. With a final, desperate effort, Jack wrenched his arm free and plunged the knife into the figure's chest. There was a moment of silence, and then the figure dissolved into a cloud of darkness, its form dissipating into the air. Jack fell to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The forest was silent once more, the oppressive presence gone. Jack stumbled back to his car, his mind reeling from the night's events. He drove back to town, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, his mind racing with thoughts of what had happened. He never spoke of the encounter to anyone, knowing that no one would believe him. The forest remained a place of mystery and fear, its dark secrets hidden from the world. But Jack knew the truth. He had faced a darkness that few had ever encountered, and he had survived. The experience left him changed, haunted by the memory of the figure and the oppressive presence that had followed him. He never returned to the forest, choosing instead to find solace in the safety of civilization. The thrill of stealth camping had lost its appeal, replaced by a deep, abiding fear of the unknown. And as the years passed, Jack could never shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, watching and waiting in the shadows.